Paul Melly is a journalist, a consulting fellow for the Africa programme at the Chatham House think tank here in London. Paul Melly, tell us your take on Wagner Group. Are they behind the coup? Are they trying to support the president? What do you think?
Well, I don't think Wagner were behind the coup. In fact, it's unlikely that they had any foreknowledge of it at all, because the coup seems to have been a very closely guarded move, just really within a very small clique of military officers. But Mr. Prigozhin has shown that he's a natural opportunist, if you like, a self-publicist for his organization. And the role that Wagner plays is very useful from a Kremlin point of view, because it allows Russia to have a degree of influence, but with one which is, if you like, distant from the Kremlin, informal, not official, deniable if necessary. And for government like the new junta in Niger, having seized power under pressure of sanctions, under pressure with the possible threat of military intervention, Wagner as a military support could be useful, but whether they could play a role that would be crucial and decisive is a much different question.
What's the role for the Westerners there? The French have taken their people out but left some soldiers behind. There's an American detachment there. The EU are saying fine words this afternoon but not doing anything. Are they just spectators?
They're not just spectators, but in the case of all three of those three actors, they're trying to strike a very difficult line. They all three had long-term military cooperation, defense cooperation agreements with the democratically elected government of President Bazoum, who's currently being detained by the junta. And they have base facilities in the case of the US and the French, quite important bases. And those bases are really there primarily to support the efforts of the Sahelian countries, such as Niger, in fighting the jihadist armed groups. That's the main reason for their presence. So neither France nor the US and nor the EU, which doesn't operate bases, but which operates long-term training programs, they don't want to pull out instantly while this crisis is still being managed by ECOWAS. But they also don't want to be seen as interfering directly in the internal affairs of Niger as a West African country, because the French in particular are very, very acutely aware of the extent to which there's a generalized popular anti-French, anti-Western feeling, but particularly anti-French feeling in a lot of West Africa at the moment. And they don't want to be seen doing anything which stirs that up further. So they're just keeping a stable, passive presence for the moment, and nothing more than that.
We've got almost a complete picture from West Coast to East Coast through the Sahel, haven't we, of countries that have now had coup, destabilising moments. If we zoom out and look at this on a global scale, is this a sort of Russia versus the West or the global North played out in Middle Africa?
I think it's Russia being opportunist, to be honest. The crisis in the Sahel was already very far developed, long before Russia became involved through the Wagner Group. The Russians are taking advantage of situations where countries have become very, very fragile. And we saw it, first of all, in the center of the continent, in the Central African Republic, with an elected but weak government under pressure from rebel groups, then seeking weapons from Russia, which was actually internationally agreed, with the UN giving approval for that. But then Russia arranging for the Wagner Group to be deployed to provide military training, in the end, probably around 1,000 troops. Now, what's happened in West Africa, in the Sahel, is we've seen governments that seized power militarily through undemocratic means. They need support. And of course, because they've overthrown the constitutional elected governments, they're isolated from the normal patterns of regional partnership. They're effectively suspended from ECOWAS, the regional bloc, and they've lost access to a lot of international aid. And so they are then turning to Wagner in the case of Mali, and probably it seems now Niger, on a sort of immediate crisis, opportunistic basis. But whether Wagner will be able to provide decisive levels of support, that's a different question. If you look at the security situation in Mali, where the biggest threat is coming from jihadist armed groups, Wagner haven't been particularly effective. And in some cases, the situation has got worse, not just in narrow security terms, but we've seen a deepening of violence on an ethnic, intercommunal basis. The United Nations reported recently that the Malian army, in partnership with its foreign allies, which, if you like, is a polite way of referring to Wagner, had carried out a massacre in the village of Moura, in which 500 civilians were murdered. We've also seen a slippage towards such ethnically tinged violence or intercommunally loaded violence in Burkina Faso as well. And there is now a risk that in Niger, where such issues have been managed much better, those sort of the Nigerian governments have been much better historically and under President Bazoum and his predecessors at managing the differences between different communities and binding everybody into a sense of national unity.
OK, Paul, we must leave our conversation there for tonight. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Paul Melly from the Chatham House think tank.